The vice president never got on the plane. That is where this story begins. Islamabad was being prepared. The route was being secured. The next round of talks was being spoken about as if it still had a living chance. J.D. Vance was on standby. Steve Witkoff was on standby. Jared Kushner was on standby. The White House behaved as if the choreography was ready. And then the one thing that mattered never happened. Iran did not send its delegation. That is not a scheduling problem. That is a strategic exposure. Because the real story is not that Trump extended the ceasefire. The real story is that Trump discovered in public that hurting an adversary is not the same thing as making that adversary obey. That is the master axis. Everything in this file hangs from that one distinction. Trump went on CNBC and said the Iranians had no choice. He said America had taken out their Navy, their Air Force, their leadership. He said the United States was now in the strongest possible position for negotiations. He spoke like a man describing an enemy whose options had been burned away. Hours later, the delegation was still not on the aircraft. That contrast matters more than the rhetoric, because it reveals the central truth of the current phase. Trump can bomb, Trump can blockade, Trump can posture, Trump can keep negotiators waiting in Washington. What he cannot yet do is convert battlefield damage into political obedience from Tehran. That is the real humiliation in this story, not the one he tries to impose, the one he suffers. And once you see that, the whole structure begins to clarify. There is a word for this problem. The obedience gap, the gap between proving that you can hurt the other side and proving that the other side now has no choice but to move on your terms. Trump thought the gap had closed. Iran just showed him it had not. That is why the file matters so much. On the surface, the ceasefire extension can be sold as prudence. Trump can say he is giving diplomacy more time. He can say the Iranian government is fractured. Pakistan asked for delay, that the United States remains ready and able while the other side gets itself together. But that is not how this looks once you strip away the language. It looks like a White House that expected movement and did not get it. It looks like a president who said Iran had no choice and then had to explain why Iran was still choosing. That is the deeper meaning of the ceasefire extension. It is not proof of control. It is proof of incomplete control. And that matters because Trump's whole method depends on the opposite image. He likes negotiations where the other side arrives already carrying the psychological burden of defeat. He likes to speak as though there's only one adult in the room and everyone else has already accepted that history is moving his way. He wants the spectacle, obedience, not just the substance of bargaining. That can work if the other side believes the cost of saying no is higher than the cost of looking weak. Iran is showing that for now, it does not believe that that is why the source you uploaded keeps returning to humiliation. The issue is not simply whether Tehran needs a deal. It clearly does. The issue is whether Tehran can accept a deal or even the beginning of a deal. If the first public image of that process is Trump declaring total victory and Iran appearing to crawl toward his table because it has no other option, that is politically poisonous. And it is not just poisonous in a symbolic sense. It rearranges internal power. It tells Iran, as military, clerical, and nationalist factions that moderation brought humiliation. It tells the public that pressure worked before diplomacy even started. It tells hardliners that every future compromise will be staged as surrender. That is why the cargo ship seizure matters so much too. It is not only a tactical act, it is a humiliation act, a signal that Trump still wants the same sequence. Pressure first, optics second, diplomacy third. That sequence is the trap because once Tehran believes the sequence is fixed, every de-escalatory move starts looking self-punishing. The more Iran moderates, the more Trump performs victory, the more he performs victory. The harder it becomes for Iran to keep moderating. That is how openings collapse. Trita Parsi's diagnosis is brutal because it is so simple. Trump may not be failing to get a deal because the issues are inherently impossible. He may be failing because every time a narrow opening appears, he converts it into a public dominance ritual and the other side recoils. That is not a negotiating style. That is a self-destructive feedback loop. And now the strategic layer makes the problem even worse. Iran still needs sanctions relief. That is one of the hardest realities in the file. Hormuz gives Tehran leverage. Its position at the Strait gives it the power to make the world uncomfortable. It can threaten shipping, energy flows, and market stability. It can impose costs. It can remind everyone that geography is still power. But that leverage does not rebuild Iran. It does not substitute for investment. It does not repair sanctions damage. It does not reopen the economy. That means Tehran's long-term interest still points toward an agreement. And Trump knows that. That is why, in one sense, he really does have leverage. He has sanctions. He has maritime pressure. He has already gotten himself out of the war in the narrow sense. If no deal comes and America does not return to active bombing, he can still say he avoided another endless Middle East war. he can still claim he showed strength and then showed restraint. Iran cannot say anything similar. If there's no deal, Iran remains stuck under sanctions without the relief it actually needs. That is the asymmetry. Iran needs a real agreement more than Trump does, but this is where the obedience gap becomes fatal, because leverage is not enough if every use of leverage widens the political cost of accepting the room in which leverage is supposed to produce a deal that is Trump-esque contradiction. He has enough pressure to hurt. He may not have enough discipline to convert that pressure into stable political movement. And then the next layer enters Israel. This is where the story gets even harder. Parsi's point is clear. Israel can live more easily with the United States stepping back from direct bombing than it can live with the United States. Making a real deal that includes sanctions relief, war weakens Iran quickly, sanctions weaken Iran slowly. Both serve the same long-term strategic purpose of keeping Iran constrained and unable to fully recover. A real deal interrupts that logic. A real deal gives Iran breathing room, recovery, investment, reconstruction. That is exactly what Israeli strategists do not want. Which means Trump's problem is not simply whether Tehran can be forced to. Yes, it is whether he wants to pay the political price of turning yes into a real agreement, because a real agreement would require sanctions relief, and sanctions relief would mean a much sharper confrontation with Israel and its allies than Trump may want. That creates his real bad options tree. He can get a deal and fight Israel politically. He can avoid that fight by walking away from a real agreement while still claiming he ended the war, or he can keep managing appearances, talking up progress, talking down oil, and preparing a blame story for the moment the process collapses. That third option may be the easiest one for him, and that is why the current phase feels so unstable. Trump has enough leverage to make a deal plausible. He may also have every political incentive to stop short of the kind of deal that would actually stabilize the system. That is exactly why the file S probability breakdown is so important. Parsi does not see a likely clean settlement. He sees a 25% chance of a deal, a 5% chance of full-scale war, and a 70% chance of a walkout into a new, non-negotiated status quo. That third scenario is the key because it looks quieter than war while preserving the pressure architecture that produced the war. And the obedience gap sits right in the middle of it. Trump can keep applying pressure. Iran can keep refusing to obey publicly. The war can quiet down. The sanctions can remain. The strait can stay contested. Every new seizure, every new public boast, every new provocation can become a trigger for the next round. That is not peace. It is suspended instability, and that is the larger judgment here. The real reason Trump-Iran talks are stalling is not simply that the issues are hard. It is that Trump keeps trying to stage obedience before he has actually created the conditions for agreement. He wants the image of an Iran that has no choice. Iran just showed him that it still does. That does not mean Tehran is winning. It means the war has entered a more dangerous phase, one in which the United States still has leverage, Iran still has refusal, and every move toward diplomacy remains vulnerable to the next act of public humiliation. That is not a peace process. It is a negotiation living inside a trap. And until Trump learns the difference between pressure and obedience, the trap will keep snapping shut.